Hollow Knight Silksong was one of the most anticipated games of all time before its release. After 7 years of waiting, the community had gone feral in ways I've only seen replicated in the Pikmin fandom during the wait for Pikmin 4. And then, the game kinda just came out. Yeah, Team Cherry just dropped a trailer on a random Thursday and said, "See you in 2 weeks." And see them we did. Hollow Knight Silksong is nothing short of a masterpiece and is one of the best games I've ever played. It is insanely well crafted in every aspect, from the gameplay and abilities to the visuals and soundtrack. But I'm sure you've heard all of that. Basically everyone under the sun is praising this game to high heaven. Regardless, I knew I still had to make a video about this game given that I had put 60 hours into it over the course of less than 2 weeks alone. However, this isn't just going to be a general review of the game. You're already aware of how great it is. If there's one point of controversy when it comes to this game though, it is with the difficulty. Some people love it, some people hate it, and I fall squarely in the love it category. But it wasn't always this way. In fact, during the first act of the game, I hated the difficulty and thought it was ruining an otherwise fantastic experience. But since then, I've seen the light and I've come to appreciate the value in the difficulty of not just Silksong, but other brutally hard games in general. In this video, I will talk about why I love the difficulty of Silksong, how I had to get good to 100% the game, and how you can do the same if you're still struggling. Also, in terms of spoilers, I will not be using any footage past Act 1 of the game, but I will vaguely mention portions of the game that are past Act 1 so that only people who have actually played it will understand what I'm talking about. I would consider this video to be mostly spoiler-free, but if you want to stay completely and utterly blind, why are you on YouTube? Just go play the game. And with that, my name is MJ, and this is how Hollow Knight Silksong taught me the value of difficulty. I hope you enjoy. This is a question I commonly see getting thrown around, mainly when it comes to comparing the game to the original Hollow Knight. You've got some people saying they thought Hollow Knight was difficult, but Silksong is easy, and you've got others saying they completed the Pantheon of Hollowness in the original game, arguably the hardest challenge in that game, yet they struggled in the early hours of Silksong. So, which is it? Well, difficulty is entirely subjective, so it's hard to pinpoint why some people feel the way they do, but I do have a theory. I personally believe that Silksong is an overall harder game than Hollow Knight, but there are aspects of the game that are easier. For instance, I never found myself getting lost in Silksong and not knowing where to go because it is a much more linear game. So in that sense, Silksong is easier. Additionally, being able to heal 3 masks at once, the more tools you can equip, and Hornet's more agile moveset can make combat easier, but I'll get more into that in a later section. When it comes to things like enemy patterns, health bars, and damage output, Silksong is way harder. There are considerably more flying or generally hard to take out normal enemies, bosses have huge health pools and can take a while to kill, and so many enemies and bosses do double damage. Hornet's new moveset, particularly with the diagonal pogo used in the Hunter's Crest, can take a bit to get used to, as she plays way differently than the Knight. I actually went back to Hollow Knight after 100%ing Silksong and found myself having to readapt to that game's movement again. They are way more different than most people think, making that learning curve another aspect of the difficulty that is important to consider. So I think when people say Silksong is easier, they more or less mean that there are ways to make encounters less difficult by taking advantage of the ways that the game is more forgiving than Hollow Knight. At least, that's my take. Plus, I do think the endgame bosses in Hollow Knight are harder than Silksong. Pure Vessel and Nightmare King Grim took me considerably longer than the hardest bosses in Silksong, but I have a theory about why that is the case that I'll talk about later. It is also important to note that both of these bosses are DLC, so Silksong will most definitely have bosses that are just as hard, if not harder, in its DLC. There are plenty of other factors that make this game difficult though. One massive complaint that I keep seeing online is about the boss runbacks. This is another criticism I often saw with Hollow Knight, but I never minded it there. In fact, I generally think runbacks in games like these can be good. They allow you to take a breather in between attempts, and they force you to play better because the penalty for losing is much more punishing. However, the runbacks in this game are not a great example of this. Many of them are just insanely long with tons of enemies and platforming challenges in your path. Sure, there are ways to optimize the runbacks, but it eventually gets to the point where it feels less like a breather in between attempts and more like a calculated decision made to waste as much of the player's time as possible. There is a fine line between a good runback and an annoying runback. Unfortunately, there are times where I think Silksong crosses that line, but it isn't super frequently. The main ones that come to mind are Last Judge, which can be optimized, but considering that at this point in the game you are missing a lot of your movement abilities, it can get a bit annoying, and a certain Act 2 boss in Bilewater. If you've fought it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. In addition, there are a ton of bosses that have arena gauntlets you are forced to go through every time before you fight the actual boss. This is mainly in Acts 2 and 3, but it's still an issue people have. Now, I don't think this is always bad because sometimes the arena is factored into the boss's difficulty, which I like. The Act 3 boss in the Sands of Karak is a great example of this. The boss itself is made kinda easy because you have to fight an arena right before it. However, this isn't always the case. The same boss from Bilewater is yet again a great example of this annoying design decision. I'd say that both the arenas and the runbacks are valid criticisms of certain boss fights, and they do make the game harder. But I also think these issues are greatly exaggerated online. Most of the bosses don't have any problems. So, with all of that being said, yes, Silksong is a very hard game, at least to me. But I've played hard games before. Granted, I haven't played many of them as I've never actively sought a game out just because it was hard, but what makes Silksong different? When I first started playing this game, I was immediately taken aback by the difficulty. I had just done the speedrunner achievement in Hollow Knight mere days before Silksong came out, and I could immediately see the difficulty spike. At first, I hated this change. I went in expecting to have a pretty easy time in the beginning because that's how Hollow Knight was. So when I found I was having a lot of trouble, it was frustrating. I wanted to at least see the game through to the end, but I was scared I was going to end up hating it by that point. It was kind of a mixed experience because at times I was having so much fun, but I was also getting extremely frustrated at certain points, which made me partially resent the game. But as I played more, I started to realize that all of this was by design. The game is supposed to be hard and punishing, which is something I wasn't really used to. Celeste and Cuphead are some of my favorite hard games. I've played both of them multiple times, and Celeste in particular is my second favorite game ever made. So why was I having so much trouble with Silksong? And why was I getting so frustrated when I'm used to playing games with difficulty? Those were questions I asked myself until eventually I realized that this is due to a fundamental design difference between the games. Celeste and Cuphead are both challenging games, but the penalty for dying is very low. In Celeste, you simply respawn at the start of the room you're in and can immediately try the platforming challenge again. Dying doesn't really come with a huge punishment. There aren't any lives or game overs that require you to restart levels, which makes learning this game very fun and not overly frustrating. Cuphead has a very similar design philosophy. Almost all of the levels in Cuphead are boss fights, with most of them not being any longer than 2 or 3 minutes. When you die, you can immediately hop back into the fight, and you even get a little progress bar showing how far into the fight you got, which is meant to motivate you to keep going. Silksong is not like this at all. The penalty for dying in Silksong is often very great. Save points are scarce, you drop all of your money upon dying, and boss encounters are long, meaning you might die right at the end of a fight and spend another 5+ minutes getting to that point all over again. This game is much more punishing than Celeste or Cuphead, which makes the difficulty of these games not really comparable. Some people would criticize these aspects of Silksong's design as being quote-unquote artificial difficulty, but I don't really like that term. Not only does it not really make sense because all difficulty is artificial considering you are playing a video game that took thousands of hours of labor and craftsmanship to produce, but also because it doesn't do a good job at describing how that kind of difficulty is apparently bad. The term I would prefer to use is unsatisfying difficulty, which I think is a better descriptor. Runbacks are an example of unsatisfying difficulty. It isn't the most fun thing in the world to continuously run through a long area to get back to a boss when the boss itself is the main challenge that the player is trying to surpass. Taking double damage from most enemies is not very satisfying, especially to players who are used to Hollow Knight. Being forced to initially use the diagonal pogo to do moderately hard platforming challenges isn't super satisfying for those who are used to the downward pogo or are having trouble timing it to hit the jumps correctly. When people argue that the game is too hard, they don't normally complain about the boss patterns, enemy placements, or platforming level design. They're referring to these other aspects that make the difficult sections unsatisfying and frustrating. But something being unsatisfying does not mean it is bad. Why do you think Team Cherry made these decisions? Was it because they were too good at the game to notice how this could be frustrating? Was it because Team Cherry doesn't know how to design a game well? Or was it maybe because they wanted these sections to be unsatisfying? Take Bilewater, for example. This is the most frustrating area in the game for many players because it is filled with flying and hard to reach enemies, maggots that prevent you from healing, very few save points, and perhaps the most annoying boss in the game. This area was clearly crafted specifically to bully the player, to make them frustrated with the game. But you know what? Once I finished this area and beat the boss at the end, I was extremely satisfied with myself. It felt like I had accomplished something that the game didn't want me to accomplish because of how much crap it was throwing at me. Getting to the end of Bilewater felt like I was showing Team Cherry that they couldn't break me, which left me thinking, is that all they got? And that is the crux of this video. Yes, the difficulty can be artificial or unsatisfying or frustrating or whatever, but that's the point. If Team Cherry changed Bilewater to make the enemies less annoying, got rid of the maggots, and put benches all over the place, it wouldn't be nearly as memorable or frankly fun to play. It is for this reason that Bilewater is genuinely one of my favorite areas in Silksong from a game design perspective, which I know will make some of your heads turn. Yes, Silksong is a frustrating game. It is made to bully the player, but it also forces them to get good. I've never felt so accomplished to simply beat a game before, to push through difficult challenges that the developers actively wanted to be frustrating. Remember when I was talking about Nightmare King Grim and Pure Vessel earlier and how they took me longer to beat than any boss in Silksong? Well, I think the reason for that was that the rest of Hollow Knight was not nearly as difficult. I was never challenged that heavily by a boss where I had to really sit down and learn their patterns inside and out. In addition, those bosses deal double damage with every attack, which is something that was very rare in the original game. But in Silksong, practically everything does double damage, and I had to learn the patterns for every boss in the game to win. It forced me to get good and truly make use of every little hint of grace the game gives you to succeed. However, I can understand that this type of gameplay is not for everyone. Not everyone wants to be this heavily challenged and spend a ton of time learning boss patterns or doing these same runbacks over and over again. And as I mentioned earlier, there are definitely aspects of this game's difficulty you can criticize, which even Team Cherry is aware of. That's why they nerfed most of the environmental hazards to not do double damage anymore, because they realized that it was a bit too punishing. If you don't want to get good, that's okay, but you have to recognize that. The game isn't badly designed, it just might not be for you. It's okay to vocalize that and be disappointed that you couldn't enjoy it, but to claim that the game is too hard and that the people at Team Cherry are bad developers is extremely bad faith. But what if you do want to get good and you're having trouble? In what ways can you improve your gameplay experience and learn to love this kind of difficulty like I did? As I mentioned in an earlier section, there are things about this game that you can use to make it easier. For one, use your tools. This is a point I cannot stress enough because there are upgrades and tools all over the place that are borderline overpowered. The Fractured Mask, Curve Sickle, Polyp Pouch, Conch Cutter, Tax, and Cog Flies are all really good and can absolutely melt bosses. One reason why I love the tool system is how customizable it is and how many new opportunities it gives you. I find myself rarely using the silk skills because they cost silk, which could prevent me from healing. But with the tools, I still have ways of ranged attacking and using other abilities outside of my needle. The funny part is though, I didn't even end up finding most of these tools until close to the end of the game. And even then, the tools I did have in the early game, I barely used because I wasn't used to them and I was scared of wasting shell shards. My experience could have been so much easier if I had found some of these tools earlier and actually used them in the early game and beyond. And if there is a boss that's giving you a lot of trouble, there's no shame in coming back to it later after you've gotten some more upgrades. For example, there's a really hard arena in Act 2 that I'm sure most of you know about, and it was absolutely destroying me. So I decided to come back later after getting some more tools and unlocking some new abilities, and I beat it on my first try. Yes, this game is more linear than Hollow Knight, so you can't be insanely overpowered for any given fight, but there are still always new upgrades to get that can make the game easier. I would recommend taking your time with this game so you can truly get sucked into the gameplay and the world. My second piece of advice would be to change your mindset about dying and fighting bosses. Do not be afraid to die or take a long time to beat any given boss, because as I mentioned earlier, the game is supposed to be hard. You're supposed to die over and over again to truly learn the patterns and get good. If you're concerned about wasting shell shards like I was, my strategy would be to not use any tools when you're first attempting the fight so that you can focus more on learning the attacks. Then, once you feel like you've gotten familiar enough with the fight, break out the tools and go wild. This will probably make the fight a lot easier for you. Something else to remember is to not get greedy. This game is insanely punishing, so your number one goal should be to not get hit as much as possible. Yes, these boss fights can be long, that's a criticism I have with the game, but that only makes it more important that you do not get hit. The more you focus on not getting hit, the better you will get at predicting the enemy's movements, which can help you to get extra damage in once you've spent more time practicing. My third and final piece of advice would be to take breaks. I understand that hearing this might frustrate you because you just want to keep playing the game even when you're really struggling, but all you're gonna do is waste more time by continuing to push yourself. Go get some water, go have a snack, and I mean, if you're really struggling, you can always look up a video on YouTube of someone else fighting the boss. Maybe there's a strategy they use that you didn't think of, or there's a tool that's really good against the boss that you don't have yet. Giving yourself a chance to recharge, rethink your strategy, and especially calm down if you're getting frustrated does wonders. If you're feeling discouraged or worried that you won't be able to beat a boss, I promise you can. Something that I experience personally when I play hard games is that once I know I'm close to the end of a challenge, it helps motivate me because I know that it's possible. A concept that I recently learned in my college psychology class is the difference between eustress and distress. Eustress is when something is stressful, but it's exciting for you. It's something that people actively seek out. Distress is when the feeling becomes negative and overwhelming. It's what most people think of when they think of stress. Hard video games can often elicit both types of stress in the player. This is a reason why I love the difficulty of Silksong so much. The punishing nature of its design makes getting through the game more exciting. Each boss fight is exhilarating because failure could risk having to start from the very beginning. But it is important to make note of when that eustress starts to become distress. When you start to become frustrated and overwhelmed rather than excited, that's when you should consider taking a break. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that every time I've gotten distressed while playing Silksong, I've taken a break, because that would be a lie. I personally think that some distress can be okay as long as it's not constant. Being able to recognize when that distress is becoming too much and that you should take a break is a very useful skill that will not just make you better at the game, but will also improve your enjoyment of it. Hollow Knight Silksong is one of my favorite games ever made, and I don't think that would be the case if it weren't for the difficulty. While it is hard to an almost unfair degree, that's the point. The game is supposed to challenge you and force you to fight back against all the crap that it sends your way. Yes, there are moments where I think the game could have been a bit more fair, and there are definitely things to criticize about it. But it's clear that everything they did here was for a reason, and if Team Cherry decides to go back on some of their decisions because they feel it will improve the gameplay experience, I'll support them. I didn't mind that some bosses like Morwing and Sister Splinter were nerfed because it was Team Cherry's decision. As I said earlier, if Silksong just isn't for you because it's too hard, that's okay. There's no shame in backing down. And while part of me wants to say that Team Cherry should have implemented an easier difficulty to satisfy those players, I also know that would have taken away some of what makes this game special. If they did have that easy mode, I probably would have turned it on as soon as I saw the Bell Beast doing double damage, and I would have never gotten as skilled at the game as I am now. I'm no expert or anything, but the harder difficulty pushed me to try to master the game in a way I haven't really needed to for most games out there. At the end of the day, you just gotta do what Hornet says and get good. I hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.